Maybe it's just me, but I think everyone has a quiet fascination with England and British people, and we perfect our British accents, we watch BBC television shows, we study British literature in our high schools, and I think for some people this quiet interest turns into an extreme fascination. When I started taking AP Lit, I got really interested in British culture. I wanted to read as many English classics as I could. I started researching England and looking at pictures and trying to figure out how on earth I could possibly get to England, because just looking at it wasn't going to be enough for me. I had to see it. When I had to figure out a project for directed studies, immediately I thought of planning a trip to England. My parents had basically told me if I figured out how to get us there, they would try to make it work. So I immediately started thinking of what I'd want to see, where I'd want to stay, how I'd get there, and this project just got super fascinating. When I started researching places to go, I focused mainly on London because it's easier to plan a trip to a city. But, you think you've got a city figured out. I expected lots of double-decker buses and telephone booths and going to all of these big major tourist sites. But as I continued to study, I found so many cool, neat little places that I wouldn't have seen before. Some of the things I took into consideration while doing this project was where I'd want to stay. Did I want to just go to London and see all of the typical touristy things like Buckingham Palace and Trafalgar Square, or did I want to kind of branch out and go to the country and see places like the Peak District in Yorkshire and the Cotswolds and things like that? It was kind of hard to figure out what to do for a lot of my products because I couldn't really make any major decisions until my parents figured out if this was actually going to work. So instead of buying plane tickets or, renting apartments, I learned the history of some really neat places like the Tower of London and how it used to be a prison and now it holds the royal jewels. I also learned about cool places outside of London like Bath. That's where Jane Austen spent a little bit of time, and I love Jane Austen, I love her books, but it was cool to kind of research Bath a little more and learn about the hot springs that people go to, because they believe it will heal you, and kind of see a different side of Bath other than just the Jane Austen side. I had a lot of fun looking into places like the Peak District because that's where Pride and Prejudice was filmed, where Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre takes place, and so it was neat to look at pictures and kind of imagine myself in the places that the characters from some of my favorite books were able to walk, to be able to kind of imagine what it would be like to be there with them. Another place that I looked at was Glastonbury Abbey, which is this old rundown church where King Arthur was buried. And I watched this BBC show called Merlin, so I kind of knew a little bit about King Arthur, and it was really neat because it says that he was buried with Guinevere, and when they found their graves, they dug her up with hair still intact, which is really neat to learn. I think it's hard to be obsessed with England and not at least a little bit interested in Shakespeare, so as I was researching different places, and especially London, I really looked into Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, which is still standing, and I think how cool would it be to go see one of Shakespeare's plays performed in its original theater. Usually you stay in a hotel when you go to visit someplace you haven't been before, but Miss Finko showed me this really neat website called One Fine Stay where you can live in people's summer homes or vacation homes, and so you could stay in a bedroom like this while you experience England, and I think that would be so much cooler. Since I've only traveled outside of the country once that I can remember, I looked into kind of tips for tourists, and I found some fun things I wouldn't have thought about, like wearing your camera on your shoulder instead of around your neck so you don't look silly, and obviously keep your money in a safe place, wear comfortable shoes, and other things that would help me pack and be prepared. When traveling to another country, you have to take into account different currencies and an exchange rate. So I did a lot of converting from dollars to pounds to try to figure out a budget. And right now, $1 buys roughly 0.6 British pounds. So you always needed more dollars than you did pounds, which was confusing and kind of depressing because you always thought you would need less until you did the conversion. For another one of my products, I decided to look into British food. You hear about fish and chips and tea and scones, and I ended up making scones, which was super easy and I think something I'll continue to do, but it was neat to see how the British name their food. Instead of just calling something like a hamburger and french fries, they name them something a little more exciting like Toad in the Hole. One of the books I read outside of other classes was this book by Bill Bryson called Notes from a Small Island, and it's all about the little idiosyncrasies of British people and just how England works, and it was so fun to read. I felt like he was sitting there telling me all about England with exaggerated hand motions, and it just made me so excited to go. I can't stand it. In trying to plan a trip to England with my parents, I kept trying to drag it out and add more days and make it as long as I possibly could. And my mom finally said, Mallory, just go find, like a summer study abroad thing for high schoolers. So I just kind of went looking, and I didn't think I'd find anything, but I ended up stumbling upon this really neat program called Summer Fuel at Oxford. Summer Fuel is where you stay at Oxford College for a month and you get to study two things of choice, like some of their options are Shakespeare or photography or creative writing, which all sound really neat to me. And you get to travel across, a greater area of England, like you visit some castles, you take day trips to London, and you just really get to experience England rather than just going as a tourist for a week. I think one of the biggest things I learned in this whole project was that there is so much more to England than just London and the big cities that you hear about. There are little towns out in what seems like the middle of nowhere with so much history behind them, and that to just go and spend a week in the city wouldn't give me even a tiny taste of what the whole of England was like. One of the quotes in our agenda book a couple weeks ago was by Shirley MacLaine, and she said, "The more I travel, the more I realize that fear makes strangers of people who should be friends." And that's something that's really stuck out to me as I've learned more about England and had this strong desire to go, because being afraid to travel to different places is only going to hold us back. There are completely different cultures out there and new people to see and things to learn about, and why not start now traveling to as many places as you can, especially when it's someplace you love. And so as I've done this project, I've only grown to love England more and gotten even more excited to travel there, hopefully this summer.